After months of delay, Parliament has finally been able to publish its report into allegations of Russian interference in British public life. It accuses the government and the intelligence services of failing to investigate the nature of the threat and how it might have affected, for example, the 2016 EU referendum. The findings by the Intelligence and Security Committee say ministers and officials were playing catch-up despite suggestions of interference in the previous referendum on Scottish independence in 2014. Downing Street denied it had badly underestimated the threat from Russia. Our political editor Laura Kuenssberg has more details.
Here we go.
9 months overdue, after years of suspicion. Finally, in black and white, Parliament's independent verdict on how Russia threatens the UK. But rather than explosive new facts, a different finding.
Shocking. The outrage, astonishing.
There was reason to fear Russia might meddle in the biggest decision in decades, the EU referendum. But evidence of that, the government didn't seek and didn't find.
The UK government have actively avoided looking for evidence that Russia interfered. We were told that they hadn't seen any evidence, but that is meaningless if they hadn't looked for it. The committee found it astonishing that no one in government had sought beforehand to protect the referendum from such attempts or investigated afterwards what attempts to influence it there may have been.
The outrage isn't that there was interference. The outrage is that no one has wanted to know if there was interference. Successive governments have welcomed Russian oligarchs and their money with open arms. And there is a lot of Russians with very close links to Putin who are now very well integrated into both UK business, political and social scene.
Is it your belief that the government deliberately looked the other way? Or do you think that they simply dropped the ball in terms of looking for political interference? And who do you hold responsible?
I wouldn't want to say that the UK government deliberately avoided asking the questions. But nevertheless, they did avoid asking the questions.
The security and defence, I think, of not only our democracy but our people should be the first role of government. The government here have clearly let us down.
MPs say there's reason to believe Russia tried to interfere in the vote on Scottish independence in 2014, but there wasn't the capability or the curiosity to monitor interference in the EU referendum. As successive prime ministers tried to manage the awkward diplomatic dance, oligarchs are accused of trying to buy influence in London. The committee also claims Number 10 misled the public when they said there wasn't time to complete all the checks and process around the report before last year's election.
Are you saying he's lied about why it should be published?
I know there's a new thing that if Number 10 says something, it's got to be true. Unfortunately, on this occasion, it clearly wasn't.
Number 10's adamant they did nothing wrong and the EU referendum was fair.
Did Russia interfere?
And the Foreign Secretary, with his American counterpart today, rejected the committee's claims.
Russia is a top national security priority. We call out Russia when it's necessary. We've shown that. We are not for a second complacent about the threat Russia poses when it comes to cyber.
Labour's echoing the committee's call to investigate now what went before.
The report is quite damning. It paints a very bad picture of a government that was far too slow to wake up to the threat posed by Russia towards our democracy, far too slow to take the actions required.
Well, good morning, everybody. And
yet as Cabinet met in person, spaced out today, in the gilded caverns of the Foreign Office, it was clear the government wants to move on, with little desire to dwell on this awkward subject. Laura Kuenssberg, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, as we heard there, today's report by the Commons Intelligence and Security Committee described Russian influence in the UK as the new normal and said that successive governments had welcomed rich oligarchs with open arms without asking too many questions about the source of their wealth. Our security correspondent Gordon Corera has more details.
The UK is one of Russia's top intelligence targets, today's report said, but it questions whether the country is equipped to respond. The The report details Russia's aggressive use of spying, especially in cyberspace, stealing information. It points to its use of assassination, going after Russians abroad like Sergei Skripal, poisoned with nerve agent in Salisbury in 2018. And most significantly, it points to a long-running campaign of political interference, meddling in events around the world. This Russian campaign is the new normal, we were told today. But the report also says the UK has been slow to respond. It is tough on Britain's spies, saying they treated the task of defending the democratic system like a hot potato, with no one wanting to take charge amid competing demands like stopping terrorist attacks. But the real criticism is for government, for failing to give the spies clear direction, and as well as not investigating recent events like the Brexit referendum. The report also says there was a longer-term problem of not seeing the challenge from Moscow. The killing of Alexander Litvinenko in London using radioactive polonium 14 years ago was a clear indication of the danger, the committee said, but it was a warning that went unheeded, his widow told me. Do you feel that Britain failed to learn the lesson of what happened to your husband in 2006?
Unfortunately, I would like to say yes. And because it was not strong reaction after that, we received Salisbury. Now we're discussing about hacking and attacks to try to get a vaccine from British scientists.
Why has there not been a tougher line? The committee says Russian money has been allowed to seep into public life, what it calls the London laundromat, recycling illicit cash, while powerful oligarchs aid the Kremlin. All of this buys Moscow influence, according to one witness who gave evidence to the committee.
There's a lot of Russian money sloshing around London, and it creates an enormous conflict of interest. And that conflict of interest creates political pressure. And I think the reason why things haven't been done is because there's too many people who are feeding at the trough.
There had been speculation that one former Russian official, now a British citizen, who's given more than £1 million to Conservatives might be named in the report. But he was not. And he told me there was a Russian threat, but it's about more than money.
It's not a report about me. It's a report about us. Because they are really threat. Russian threat exists. That's absolutely. As my point is this, what is the most serious threat is cyber attack.
Existing laws may be out of date and new powers needed to counter Russian spies and influence, the committee said. But today's report also raises questions as to whether the British state has not just the tools, but the desire to confront Moscow. Gordon Corera, BBC News.
Let's go live to Moscow tonight and talk to our correspondent, Steve Rosenberg. Steve, is there any specific response there in Moscow, other than a kind of blanket rejection, to any of the points raised by the committee?
Not really, Huw. No, Moscow did today what Moscow always does in this kind of situation when accused by the West, and that is to deny everything. So we heard the Russian Foreign Ministry dismiss the Russia report as Russophobia and fake. We heard the Kremlin say, well, Russia's never meddled in any election in Britain, America, anywhere. But I think privately the Russians will be quite pleased with the contents of this report because Russia comes out of it looking strong. I mean, listen to some of the language used to describe Russia. An accomplished adversary, a highly capable cyber actor. In comparison, Britain looks weak in face of the Russia threat. So will Vladimir Putin be quaking in his boots? I don't think so. I think more likely Russia will look at this report as evidence, as proof that its methods are working. And that means that we can expect more attempts by Russia to undermine Western democracies, Western institutions, to sow division amongst Western allies, because that's how Moscow believes it can gain a geopolitical advantage.
Steve, many thanks again. Steve Rosenberg there, our correspondent in Moscow tonight. Well, as we saw, the Russia report featured in today's news conference involving the Foreign Secretary and the US Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, who's been visiting the UK. Mr. Pompeo said that in his view, China was a greater threat to stability than Russia. And he congratulated Boris Johnson on the recent decision by the UK to stop using Huawei technology, that's the Chinese technology giant, in the new 5G mobile network. Now, our diplomatic correspondent James Robbins was monitoring the events today for us. What did you make of the exchanges today, James?
Well, that's right. Mike Pompeo heaped praise on Britain, on Boris Johnson, on Dominic Raab for shutting out Huawei. Well done, he said. And Dominic Raab looked a bit uncomfortable at that. I think sensing the trap that people would perceive that as evidence of Britain as America's poodle. So he stressed in return that the Huawei decision was based on what the Foreign Secretary called the reality of US sanctions. Mike Pompeo invited Britain and others who want to uphold shared values to join a coalition against China in a new Cold War. Now, Britain really doesn't want to be put in that position. Mike Pompeo is a well-known Sinophobe, a hater of the Chinese Communist Party. Boris Johnson has made clear that he is not a Sinophobe, wants to engage, wants to keep open vital trade and investment links. So you can see a tension there. Yes, Britain has taken measures against China over the Uyghur Muslims and over Hong Kong and the suppression of freedoms there, but it hasn't yet moved to the position it's taken up with Russia of naming specific Chinese individuals, which would certainly open up grounds for even greater retaliation. I mean, it's been an extraordinary day. How to deal with Russia, a threat, but a declining power with a shrinking economy. How to deal with China, a rising power, which will almost certainly eclipse the United States in the second half of this century.
Fascinating, James. Thanks very much again. James Robbins there, our diplomatic correspondent.